This is obviously a difficult time to talk about these issues, but in many ways, it's probably the most important time to talk about these issues. And when we put together the title for the talk, what is anti-Semitism? When did it begin? Does it change? And when will it end? I feel like I engaged in a bit of false advertising. Because if I'm forced to answer those questions for you, I can't. What is anti-Semitism? I don't really know. When did it begin? I don't really know. Does it change? Yes, if we accept that there is a thing such as anti-Semitism. And when will it end? And that question we'll deal with at the end, unfortunately. So I don't want to stop the talk here and just leave. That would be unfair. So let's see what we can know. What questions can we ask? Although I would just say that it's important to be prepared that there is not necessarily one answer or one solution here, which I know makes at least historians somewhat uncomfortable. So if we start with what is anti-Semitism, if this were a sort of normal class and we weren't dealing with the people in virtual reality out there, I would go around the room and ask people for their impressions of what is anti-Semitism. But for the sake of time and managing this, I will just refer to some discussions I've had with my students when I posed that question. And unfortunately, I guess from the students at my college generally are very nice young people. They are not anti-Semites. So when I ask them what is anti-Semitism, they really can't answer because they haven't grown up in a culture or households where they're used to the various stereotypes that are often associated with anti-Semitism. So I often joke that my course on anti-Semitism at the college is a way to give people all the tools to become anti-Semites, which is not a great way to think about education. But here, if we think about anti-Semitism together, I think we could agree, however we might individually identify it or describe it, that at least in the popular conception of anti-Semitism in the media, forgive me, and in other kinds of popular cultural institutions, and also in some academic circles, anti-Semitism is usually associated with the long-term, unchanging hatred or animosity to the Jews that moves through time in a very fixed way. That is, it appears in human history almost fully formed as a kind of virus, a kind of biological image, and then proceeds to move through time until it reaches the contemporary period. And I think it's important to address, I think it's important to ask several questions about this default image of a kind of permanent, unchanging anti-Semitism, what one Israeli historian has called the longest hatred. Why have we defaulted to this idea of anti-Semitism as such a timeless attitude? And I think there are several possible answers to it. One is that the Christian idea of the permanent or continuing importance of Jews to the history of Christianity. That is, Christians and Jews moved together through time, for better or for worse. And that was also transmitted to Islam. So that there's a sense that if Christians had this timeless or eternal relationship with Jews, they would certainly have a similar kind of timeless or eternal relationship with this thing that came to be called anti-Semitism. And Jews continue to mean things or are meaningful for Christians in ways that are often problematic, something that I'll try to return to at the end of the talk. But again, the sense in Christian culture and history of seeing meaning in the Jews also suggests a kind of preparation to see anti-Semitism as moving through time. There are ways in which, at various points in European history, Christian culture, Jews mean particular things. So, I've been looking recently at the way 19th century Protestant historians see the survival of the Jews as a kind of miracle, particularly at a time when traditional miracles don't seem to be as acceptable, right? There's a kind of pressure of rationality of science, so that makes it difficult to embrace the miraculous. But if you look at the survival of the Jews in the diaspora, that's a pretty good miracle. So then the history of the Jews has a meaning over time for this larger Christian culture. We'll come back to that idea at the end. There's also the modern idea of race itself, which if I were to teach another course, I would be teaching a course about why sort of racial thinking has in a way kind of distorted and damaged our ability to see sort of the nuances and meaning of history in some ways. But certainly the modern idea of race, from the 19th century onward, which sees racial identity as a kind of fixed characteristic in human populations and human history, that also reinforces the idea that what comes to be the racial antagonism against the Jews must have this fixed attitude, must have this fixed idea that moves through time without changing. There's also the scientific approach. In science, one looks for origins, right? One looks for origins. So, post-19th century scientific world, if we want to think about anti-Semitism, if we think about the hatred of Jews, well, there must be an origin point for it, because that's the way science works, right? There's a big bang, there's an evolutionary moment, there's a point in time that can be fixed. So that also reinforces the sense that anti-Semitism appears at a certain point and then continues through time. I think it's also related, speaking as a medievalist, it's also related to the perception of the Middle Ages in general. And again, if we were doing another course, I'd go around the room and ask everybody's vision of what the Middle Ages are. And just to kind of abbreviate, everybody says, dirty, superstitious, violent, hierarchical, all the horrible things that we associate with pre-modernity. And then I try to spend the rest of the semester telling them, no, the Middle Ages is actually, quite dynamic. Universities, cities, commerce, exploration, printing, et cetera, et cetera. Doesn't seem to matter very much, because it still is the Renaissance and the early modern period that, changes all of this. So the long-term how do I want to say this? Sort of the long background or the long trail of anti-Semitism seems to find a natural home in the perception of the pre-modern world, particularly the medieval period, as one of violence and superstition and fanaticism. So in that sense, too, that gives a kind of matrix, a kind of the DNA of a long view of anti-Semitism seems to fit with our long view of a pre-modern, superstitious, violent, persecutorial period, followed by, at least we think, a period of enlightenment and toleration. And then, of course, the last point here, there are others, but for our purposes, the last point here that gives this long-term, unchanging view of anti-Semitism is the Holocaust, right? Everything we do as Jewish historians, as scholars of anti-Semitism, takes place in the shadow of the Holocaust. And I think it's the enormity of the Holocaust, it's the truth that it came out of Christian societies in Europe, that must be explained, right? It is something that must be understood. And if it's something that is so deeply embedded in the DNA, the cultural DNA, the structures of these societies, therefore it must have a long-term background, right? It can't be something that just appeared. It must be something that's somehow deeply part of the evolution of this culture and time. So therefore, it pushes us back to look to a kind of long-term answer, a long-term thinking about what anti-Semitism is. So I think those are all very strong reasons. It makes sense. All of these help us make sense of why our instinct generally, you have to accept my proposition that the general perception of anti-Semitism is one of a kind of long, fixed almost virus-like movement of an idea and a feeling through time, okay? So I'm going to try to argue against that. I'm going to try to say that all of these things that draw us to a long-term vision of anti-Semitism are really quite problematic, and I think distort the nuances and complexities of human history, and continue to do so. Because is this really an accurate or effective or productive way of understanding the past? To think of something that moves through time, begins at a certain moment, moves through time, and acts this way, the way we think that anti-Semitism does. Is there anything else that we study in history that we treat the same way? And I don't think there is. I mean, I'm doing this for the sake of the argument to be provocative. I mean, you might come up with things and we can talk about them. But nationalism, for example, or origins of states. Benedict Anderson writes about the constructed nature of nationalism, right, in the 18th and 19th centuries. So it's only, the most kind of right-wing nativist person or movement that would say, the French nation, goes back to the Gauls at this point. So we have at least the way we challenge thinking about the origins of nationalities and nation states. We have much more nuance about that than we do about thinking about the changes or evolution in this idea of anti-Semitism. What else? In terms of psychology, I think that this notion of anti-Semitism, in a way, actually, I probably should have put this in the other category. That is, modern sensibilities or modern ideas about psychology or psychiatry, kind of the fixed personality of people, that I can't decide whether that helps or hinders the understanding of anti-Semitism as a kind of permanent part of human history and human culture. I guess I would say, if I were pushed to say that we think, after Freud, we kind of think that there are, fundamental impulses to human identity, to human desires and needs. So maybe in that sense, it supports the sort of long-term understanding of anti-Semitism. But, Freud is under great criticism, sort of the biological origins of personality, identity, psychology. That may have created sort of a more nuanced understanding of the way ideas or character or culture changes over time. So perhaps that's another sort of criticism of this thinking about anti-Semitism. Certainly in anthropological terms, sort of the notion that anthropology sees certain fixed behavioral patterns in communities, the scapegoat, for example. I think some of those are also being subject to criticism as well. And then also finally a notion of the kind of crisis of modernity, right? That if we take modernity seriously as a time period and as something that shapes our ideas and behaviors, are we really doing it justice? Are we really doing this issue of anti-Semitism justice by ignoring these divisions? So all of that is to say that I think the way we think about anti-Semitism as this long-term factor in human history and culture is somewhat unique. It's interesting to think about why it's so unique, but it's somewhat unique. I don't think we apply to other aspects or features of human social, cultural development the same nuances to anti-Semitism. We seem to be very comfortable, almost relieved maybe, simply to be able to say, yes, anti-Semitism, there's a beginning, it develops, it's still with us. It exists outside of time and culture in some ways. And we would not apply that same sort of superficial analysis to many of the other things that I've just talked about, right? Nationalism, psychology, anthropological relationships, ideas about capitalism and modernity. All of those things we subject quite nuanced criticism to in order to see their particular context and development. But for anti-Semitism, we seem to say, it's just something that we accept as part of the human either character or cultural development. Okay? So is that the best way to really think about hatred of Jews? No, it's not. And if you take even just a very superficial, as I'll proceed to do now, look at 2,000 years of history, I think we can agree, or I hope we can agree, that the reality is much more complicated. I'm about to talk about the ancient world and late antiquity, and with Michael Saller sitting here, I'm very nervous, so I'm just going to go ahead, and then afterwards he can tell me I'm wrong, or he can wave his arms or something. So if we look at the ancient world, for example, I would argue that there is nothing that can be called or described, Pace, the work on Judeophobia. There's nothing that really can be called or described anti-Semitism as we would commonly refer to it in the media or in academic circles or in other places. The Jews in the ancient world are largely perceived as marginal. They're bizarre. They have strange food habits. They circumcise their male children, which is very strange. They only have one God, which is also very strange. But they don't bother anybody particularly. So the language and rhetoric about the Jews in the classical world is almost a non-issue. There's no fear of contamination. There's no sense that they're manipulating the economy. There's no sense that they're involved in world conspiracies. There's no sense of, their particularly evil qualities. Now, okay, why then did the Romans destroy the temple and destroy Jerusalem? Well, because the Jews rebelled, and the Romans don't like that. They did it to a lot of people. They did it to Carthage. They did it to the Gauls. They did it to lots of people. It doesn't seem to have been motivated by a particular ethnic hatred of the Jews or a particular suspicion of what they could do if they weren't eliminated. So I think that even if you I think we have to look past what happens to the temple in Jerusalem under the Romans, because the other Jewish communities survive, right? The Romans free Jewish slaves. They don't hunt them down. They don't destroy other Jewish communities. So it does not seem to me to be a period of time that produces a rhetoric or an ideology that we can understand as anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic. We'll talk about the meanings of the terms in a second, or as negative towards the Jews in a kind of systematic way. There's the argument that because of the riots in Alexandria, there is a kind of Judeophobia that arises, and one can believe that or not. It seems to me to be more of a kind of struggle of competing ethnic groups in an urban environment. Again, one that's very limited, one that's very idiosyncratic. Okay. Early Christianity, too, I think the rhetoric and language about looking for, the origin of anti-Semitism per se. Again, I have to find a different term or a different sort of linguistic marker. But if you look at early Christianity, it depends what you mean by early Christianity. Certainly, early Christianity felt themselves to be Jewish, right? They felt themselves to be from a Jewish origin. They just disagreed with other Jews about who the Messiah was. It's really even hard to talk about that as anti-Judaism in some sense, because early Christians thought that they were behaving as the fulfillment of what Judaism was. And even if you look at the rhetoric and sort of the language, the contradictory and schizophrenic language of the New Testament text, there is obviously a sense that Certain groups of Jews have rejected Jesus. But again, the language about the demonic quality of the Jews or the evilness of the Jews, that seems to me to be very limited. It seems to me to be very idiosyncratic, dependent upon which author we're talking about in which context. And again, it doesn't spark widespread violence. It doesn't trigger anything in the society. In fact, we know from other evidence that there was interaction between these communities on an urban level. People were moving from Jewish to Christian identities in some places. And then, of course, as the church develops, we have Augustine's idea of tolerance, right? That the church needs the Jews because they guarantee the antiquity and authority of Scripture. And Augustine's ideology really comes to not dominate, but animate, much of the medieval institutional church's attitudes towards the Jews. So with all of those things going on, it's again very hard to see this as a wellspring of a kind of fully fleshed out hatred of the Jews that is going to, animate and control behaviors. Now, it's not complete. I mean, people can point to Chrysostom, people can point to the very severe and harsh imperial laws that are issued against the Jews once Constantine converts. And it's true, there are points of conflict and there are points of contact. But I think what focusing on sort of the origin point of anti-Semitism does, it blinds us to the complicated nature of these late antique societies, where Jews were not the primary concern of early Christians and the early church. If you're looking at the 5th or 6th century, they seem to have had other challenges, from Germanic peoples and others who were trying to sort of take apart piece by piece the empire. There was no unified church at the beginning. They hated each other, right? The Donatists, the various other church groups, sects, kind of factions, other heretics, etc. So the complexity, the dynamism, the sort of the confusion of early Christianity and late antiquity, I think protected the Jews in a way from sort of having a kind of focused animosity on them. And we also, I think, probably underestimate or misunderstand what it meant to have a Christian identity in this early period. I think there's a projection back that, the example, sort of the visual example of the crucifix is what really animates people. But that's a very time-dependent image. And certainly for the majority of early Christians, well into the 6th or 7th century, we don't really understand what it meant to be Christian. Did it mean to go to a shrine to pray for healing? Did it mean to be engaged in certain kinds of communal activities? Did it mean a certain level of celibacy? I mean, there are many, many aspects of what early Christian identity meant that challenge and may have been replaced a kind of proto-fixation on the question of deicide and then assigning that blame to the Jews. Okay, so Michael hasn't said anything yet, so I'm not necessarily going to take that as approval. I'm just going to keep going. If we look at the early Middle Ages, for example, it's important to remember that the Jews in Europe were marginal at best, and that the center of the Jewish world was in the East under Islam. But even those early communities in the Middle Ages in Western Europe were small communities. They survived. There weren't overt periods of persecution. The Arian Visigoths in Spain don't fit the pattern completely, but they are also an exception in the sense that that kind of animosity that they seem to have had for the local Jewish community does not seem to bleed into these other places. So there are moments when certain churchmen, Agabard much later in the early Middle Ages, others get annoyed with the Jews, they get impatient with them, they see that they're too close to the court. They might have magical skills or medicinal skills that are a threat to Christian approaches. But in none of this before the year 1000 do we get any kind of sustained violence or persecutorial ideology against the Jews. Now, J. Rubenstein and others have argued that around the year 1000 you get a kind of proto-apocalyptic movement that is stimulating anti-Jewish feeling in the context of trying to think about going back to Jerusalem. Again, it's hard to see that getting traction in the society in a way that materially affects the Jewish life there, or that creates a kind of foundational rhetoric or ideology about anti-Semitism. As we move into the Middle Ages proper, the Jews become medieval people. I've written about that a lot. Elisha Korbach, Effie Shoham Steiner as well. Many other people are now thinking that the Jews become medieval people. In dress, in language, in ritual behaviors, so that, again, we don't see them living in a world that is so innately antagonistic to them that they cannot find a home, that they cannot find any kind of stability. We're doing okay? Okay. The turning point is usually the Crusades, the massacres of the Jews in the Rhineland around 1096-97. Or at least after the Crusades set off in 1096. Okay, yes, there are a significant series of attacks on the Jewish communities of the Rhineland, and people have spent their careers arguing, are there attacks led by sort of lower class or lower status crusaders who are just basically violent, or is it more led by noble or aristocratic groups of crusaders? Again, for our purposes, doesn't matter. It's not going to be resolved at the moment. Clearly, there were attacks. Something about the rhetoric or personnel who left to crusade in 1096 helped them focus on the Jews as perhaps an enemy closer to home, rather than the enemy that they were trying to reach in the Holy Land. But what is interesting about these episodes, and again, it's very easy to talk about violence as ephemeral or transitory, and I think I likely sinned too much by doing that in the book I wrote. But it is true that Jews returned to Speyer and Mainz and the other Rhineland towns very, very quickly after these attacks. And a generation or two later, these are thriving communities. Now, does that negate the experience of suffering that these people endured? Nor does it negate the experience of anxiety and fear that their children and grandchildren probably felt. But in terms of creating a viable society, they did. And again, the rhetoric and animosity and ferocity of some of these attacks did not seem to become a permanent part of Christian ideology towards the Jews. It seems to have been more along the spectrum of the Augustinian mode of tolerance and protection. Not embrace, not celebration, but of tolerance and protection. And the longer term story of the Middle Ages, which I'm going to rush through, is the same, that you have a thriving Western European Jewish society, again, marginal to the larger arc of history and the larger populations of Jews in the world, but the ones that are connected to anti-Semitism more obviously because of, sort of the cultural location. Those Jews, thrive. They build viable communities. Scholars have tried to identify turning points, either with the Crusades themselves, or if we look at the persecuting model that some scholars have tried to create for the 12th or 13th century, or a sense that there's a kind of irrational perception of the Jews that appears in the 12th and 13th century. And these are creative, interesting, provocative ways of trying to make sense of Christian attitudes towards the Jews, but they don't really work if you look at the longer arc of the Jewish experience in the Middle Ages. Yes, there were periodic attacks because of blood libel accusations, or accusations around the poisoning of wells. But again, these are idiosyncratic, they're scattered, they never cohere into one vision, they never lead to the wholesale destruction of the Jewish community or of its expulsion. And when we come to the period of expulsions in the late 13th and 14th century, and even into the early 15th century, the thing about the expulsions in France and England and elsewhere is they go to other Christian places, right? They go to Lithuania, they go to Eastern Europe, they go to other Christian communities. And when the German towns expel them, they go to other German towns, or they go to the German countryside. So there's not a way in which Europe becomes Judenrein as a way of getting the Jews out of every Christian society. It just didn't work that way. Now, it is true that over time, these accusations and suspicions about the Jews, about well poisoning, about blood libel, about things like that, that does probably build up in the cultural DNA. And Magda Tater has a recent great book on the impact of printing that reifies those images in early modern culture. So I wouldn't say that the experience of violence or persecution in the Middle Ages has no lasting impact on attitudes towards Jews, negative attitudes towards Jews. But again, if we're looking for an origin point, if we're looking for something that looks fully developed as anti-Semitism, then I don't think we're seeing it in that form, as that kind of thing in the medieval period. Okay, so we'll skip the early modern period, which is interesting because, and the Reformation, which I guess you guys don't mind if we skip the Reformation here. But simply to say that the Jewish world evolves, thrives, takes part in the world of the Renaissance, in the world of early modern Europe, in the world of exploration and expansion and economic growth of the 16th and 17th centuries. And again, despite Luther's rhetoric and despite some episodes, Europe has a lot else going on in the 16th and 17th century, rather than having to worry about a kind of straight jacket ideological vision of what Judaism does or does not mean. When we get into the 19th century, obviously, after a period of liberalization and assimilation, that's where we get the problem with the language. And I would point people to David Engel's work on, why anti-Semitism as a term really is a particular product of this 19th century political environment in Central Europe, where people who are unhappy with the degree to which Jews have been accepted as citizens of these new liberal states in Austria and Germany and elsewhere, and push back against that. They take this term, Semite, from the language, from understanding of the language divisions, and they apply it to these groups, these anti-Semitic political groups that want to keep Jews out of this culture. And the Jews actually accept that term and sort of apply it then to the violence they're seeing in Russia and the East. And it's ironic, right, that it's really sort of the Jewish historians, scholars, journalists who take this term of anti-Semitism and in some ways make it into this timeless effort. But then it's picked up clearly by others on the opposite side as well. Okay, so if we can't identify anti-Semitism as such in the late antique, medieval, early modern period, certainly can't identify it as such in the period of liberalization in the 17th and 18th and even in the early 19th century, we do see the growing intolerance of national identity, soon to be reinforced by racial thinking of the 19th century, that then culminates or is refracted in the particularly violent eliminationist kind of ideology about the Jews that we see under the Nazis. So David Engel says we shouldn't say anything is anti-Semitic. We should look at each individual context, each individual episode. And he's been very successful in sort of doing that for his period in his work, and not to call it anti-Semitism as his attempt to reject this sort of timeless nature of anti-Semitism. And I would second that and reinforce it, but it does still raise a problem about why the Jews mean so much over the course of history that people at various times will try to use the Jews to say something about their own world, or to project some kind of animosity, to project some kind of meaning onto the Jews. And we see it now too if we look at sort of contemporary anti-Semitism. And obviously I'm not an expert on this, and I'm not going to go into detail about what just happened, but in some ways Jews are now kind of stuck in the middle. On the right, the right still has a kind of tribal view of national identity with some kind of lingering Christian ideology or imagery or ideas. So the Jews become the avatars of this world conspiracy, kind of from the protocols of the Elders of Zion and others, that's threatening this resurgence of a kind of national tribal identity. And on the left, as we've just seen, the left, at least in the United States, Europe too, needs to displace the Jews as the victim very quickly, because for the left, the way the world works is a kind of racial equation, right? That white colonial Europeanists oppress peoples of color. So if the Jew is the victim there, that disturbs that equation. So you have to kind of eliminate the Jew as that traditional victim, and you have to delegitimize Israel, you have to accuse it of genocide, et cetera, et cetera. So it, again, from both sides, left and right, the Jew still means something to the worldview of both left and right. And some of these aspects of anti-Jewish thinking, of negative ideas about the Jews, whether we identify it as anti-Semitic or not, become ammunition in that struggle. So last two sentences. So why is this happening? And here is something that I wouldn't publish yet or ever, but I think does go back to, and you'll forgive me, I think does go back to the original relationship between Christians and Jews. Not that that's the starting point of anti-Semitism, that is not what I'm saying, but the appropriation of Judaism by Christianity over time, right? That is the rereading or reinterpretation of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible in terms of the New Testament. The reading by Augustine and others of what Jewish history and the survival of the Jews means for Judaism. I think in a way embedded in European culture, the idea that the Jews are allegories, they're tools, they're kind of screens on which people can project their own meaning, their own ideas. So in some ways, anti-Semitism, hatred of the Jews is a subset of that attitude, which makes the Jews a kind of vulnerable, malleable instrument in the way Christians and others now, as Islam has adopted many of these ideas, particularly as we've just seen, this sort of eliminationist kind of ideology. So if that's true, I'll go back to my last question. When will it end? I don't think it will. I mean, until everybody just puts down the Bibles and the Qurans and everything else and backs away and reads a lot of Spinoza. I don't know when it will end. And even if everybody does that, Voltaire didn't much like the Jews, and there are probably ways that the Jews could still become these allegories, these metaphors, these symbols, these tools for a society that leaves religion behind it. I don't know. So when will it end? I don't know. But that's the path to madness and despair. And it makes the work that Massimo and his colleagues here at the Bea Center all the more important and crucial.